Hello, everyone, and welcome to our This Can Happen Champions webinar. We are just going to wait another 30 more seconds or so for everyone to join, and then we will get started. Right, everyone, so let's get started. Today we are looking at Empathy Has No I, the skill of empathetic, and we are joined by the wonderful Heidi Chapman Mercer. This session is for anyone that's in a supporting mental health role. So you might have champion in your job title, you might be a mental health first aider, an ally, or an advocate. But if you're supporting the well-being of others, then this session is for you. Subtitles are available, so please do switch these on with the CC Show Captions button at the bottom and select your chosen language. A reminder that today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Champions Hub for everyone who's not able to attend live to watch afterwards. And please send through any questions that you have for Heidi via the chat box. And if you would like to remain anonymous, please send these through directly to me and I will read these out during the final 10-15 minutes slot of this 1 hour webinar. So without further ado, I will hand over to Heidi to begin the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jamie. So we are together for the next hour with a really helpful Q&A section at the end. So all of those questions, you might already have them, but any that we don't answer throughout the webinar, please keep hold of them because we will have a section at the end. So for those of you who haven't come across me within the This Can Happen program before, it's just a really short introduction to me. So you can see on the screen, I have a psychology degree. My main expertise is that I am an adult education trainer specializing in mental health and workplace wellbeing. That's my kind of passion and arena that I hold a lot of expertise and knowledge within. I have a background in executive management, C-suite roles, and working within professional sport. So a variety of things which enables me to pull both elements together, hopefully to provide you with knowledge and insight, but also hopefully lots of really practical things that you will be able to take away from today into your role as champions. So I do always like to take a starting point right at the beginning. It says important message. It is just to remind you that actually everything that you are offering in your side desk role as a champion is really, really important. And don't underestimate what you offer to other people. The ability for people to safely share what's going on with them without the risk of stigma and how much of an impact that has on other people. So I always make a point of saying that it's really important that we acknowledge that at the beginning. You acknowledge that in yourself as we lead into today's session about empathy. So, first big question is why do we need empathy? So it's a very interesting question. It's something that we talk about a lot, particularly within the mental health and mental well-being arena, is that we all need to be more empathetic. I've popped, pop any thoughts on this question into the chat function. Jamie's there being able to monitor that, but pop in why you think we need empathy as I go through the information I have to share with you. So first and foremost, empathy allows us to build social connections with others. By understanding what other people are thinking and feeling and going through, we are not only able to respond appropriately in social situations, but also research has shown that having social connections is important for our own physical and psychological well-being, which I always find a really good point to say. So although empathy, we are showing up empathetically as champions to those spaces where we are supporting someone else, there is that payback to ourselves in the fact that actually those social connections really do build that for us as well. Second thing you will see is that it helps us to learn to regulate our own emotions. It's quite interesting when we think about that. And actually, I think in the champion role in general, it's hugely insightful for our own mental well-being and our own self-care and all of those other things that we go along. But ultimately, emotional regulation is important as it allows us to manage what we're feeling, even in times where we are feeling really overwhelmed, and in particular when we're holding an empathetic space for someone else, to be able to hold what we are experiencing in order to show up for others. It promotes our helping behaviours. Not only are you more likely to engage in helpful behaviours when you feel empathy for others, but interestingly, and you will see there's a little bit of theme at the beginning part, in that it enhances our interpersonal relationship. And actually, by helping others, they're also more likely to help you, or broader than that, enter into empathetic spaces with others in other situations. Empathy from this context, we're thinking about it from a work perspective. However, entering and being purposefully empathetic is hugely powerful in all of our relationships, whether that is loved relationships with our partners, our children, family members, friendship, and broader than that. So it's quite important, actually, why we need empathy. However, it isn't always the easiest thing to do. So when is it useful? Now, that's a really big question again. So broadly, without cultivating empathy, we ultimately lack our listening skills. And as we know, the big part of being a champion is the ability to provide a space where someone feels safe, they don't feel judged, and ultimately that we are listening to them and signposting. So when we cultivate empathy, we cultivate this deep-rooted, really core listening skills. It allows us to respect others and comes back to those relationships that I spoke about on the slide before. We also have to be mindful that empathy, when we live and work in a hybrid world, as we do right now, it's really important that actually we even when we are communicating and relating to others in an online platform, empathy is still really key. It isn't something that we can think of as something that is, let's be honest, easier sometimes to do in person. It is, but it is really, really important actually that we cultivate that into our online space as well. So I of course am leading this webinar, so I'm going to say it's one of the most important tools, but it is actually. I think empathy is a core skill, and we come on to a little bit Carl Rogers and some other stuff in a few slides time, but it is the most important tool for you as a champion in that space that you offer to others. So I've kind of started in one context, and now I'm pulling it into the space where we are going to really take some time to look at what empathy is. So again, please use the chat function. Jamie's there monitoring that and being able to kind of respond. But what do you think empathy is? I can tell you what I think it is, but it's quite interesting to hear what everybody's understanding of empathy is, particularly in this context from a work perspective. So, empathy. Empathy is the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation. That's the definition. So from a dictionary, that's our definition. But we're going to dig deeper than that. You'll also see on the screen it's something that I feel if you are embodying empathy as a core skill within yourself, it is a good way to think about it in that image that up's there, which is that seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. So we are genuinely, totally enabling ourselves to put ourselves in someone else's position. What is it like? What does it see? So, empathy, there will be some phrases that you might have heard. So, a sentence such as putting yourself in someone else's shoes. really good, and analogies work for some people. Others, within kind of neurodiversity and things like that, analogies can be quite difficult to sometimes come to. But that might be an analogy that you have heard of quite often. But essentially, empathy at its core is putting yourself in someone else's position. So it's truly embodying what they must be feeling and experiencing. Doesn't mean you have to fully feel those things. It's about imagining what it is like, what that situation is like. And we will come on to a little bit later within our section today together about how you protect yourself when you are providing a space of empathy for others, because it's really important that you do protect yourself, but also when you are empathetically showing up, how you decompress afterwards. And I've got a few small practical ways we do that. It's ultimately emotionally understanding what another person is experiencing, feeling or trying to feel what the other person is expressing. It is a way of being, which I think is quite a large statement, isn't it? But there is a reason why therapists and professionals have years of training on empathy and empathetic being. It is a skill that you have to be very mindful of, actually. And I think as champions, there are some core skills that we come back to. But empathy is something that although it is a core skill and a way of being, you have to be quite mindful of it, actually. And that's why I refer to it as a way of being. It is also very different from sympathy. We come on to sympathy in a moment, and although they share a lot of letters in how they're spelt, they're two very, very different things. So there are three types of empathy, which is interesting. So all three are on the screen, a little bit colourful for this morning. The yellow is quite bright. And the yellow is where I'm going to start. So affective empathy. So kind of pull myself back a minute. So what is empathy? Empathy, there are three main types of empathy. Now, these are, and I will break down what they are. Now for you, but ultimately the three come together to form an overall empathetic way of being, or being empathetic as a general. However, as I go through these, you will naturally find that you will do one of these maybe more than others. And that's absolutely fine, because all of them are empathy. All of them fall into the key skill of being empathetic, but they are all slightly different. So the first one, which is in the middle, which is our affective empathy, is our ability to respond to another person's emotions appropriately. So it's how a person who has come to us and is reaching out has shared what they are feeling and is expressing their emotions. Effective empathy is knowing how to respond to that person's emotions appropriately. So it's kind of that emotional connection or emotional empathy. Our somatic, which is our green one on the screen at the moment, is our ability to feel what another person is feeling. So anybody who has come across somatic healing or somatic therapy, it is very much deep rooted into the body, ultimately. So it's very much a body response. So a somatic empathy is really, really being able to feel what that person is feeling, kind of in yourself, being able to do it. Not everybody naturally does this. Not everybody is expecting you to do it, but it is one form of empathy. Lastly, we have cognitively. So cognitive empathy is our ability to understand someone's response to a situation. So someone, when they are seeking you out, having a conversation, will share how they're responding, what they are doing about their emotions. Cognitive empathy is your ability to really say, to know you might not do what they are doing. You might not have responded in the way that they have responded, but ultimately, empathetically, I can say, I can see why you have responded in that way. And when we come to the core skills of how we enter into an empathetic conversation, it's our ability to park our own things. And this is where cognitive empathy particularly comes in, is parking our own things, not forgetting them, just slightly parking them in order to be able to understand how this person is responding to what they're going through. And it might be very different to how you would respond. Um, but actually that's what cognitive empathy is. So it's interesting in the sense of I find it quite interesting to spend some time as I'm going through that to kind of think, well, actually, which one you might do all of them. And that is a true empathetic individual. I naturally, I find cognitive empathy the one that I lean into and naturally am able to do a little bit easier in a non-judgmental way. Um, However, I try to embody all of them. So it's quite interesting to break it down into that kind of deeper kind of the empathy can be broken down a little bit more. So earlier on, I mentioned that empathy is one of our core conditions. So by our core conditions, a core condition is what we refer to within a therapeutic context, really, but broader than that, within a space that we are holding for anybody else. Empathy, whether you're a manager and you are managing somebody, whether you're doing a performance review, whether you are a supervisor within a team, whether you are the key caregiver within your family setting. Empathy is a core condition. And what we mean by that is that it really involves trying to understand the meaning in the other person's life and understanding why they're thinking. Carl Rogers, there's a picture of him up there. I haven't got all the time in the world to go through Carl Rogers. He's a phenomenal therapist. And if you're interested in learning more about his particular, he was key in pulling empathy into the world of core conditions from anybody who holds space for others. But if you can look him up on all search engines, there's lots of books and lots of things on YouTube and things like that that you can read about. But ultimately, he was an American psychologist and one of the founders of the humanistic approach, which is client-centered approach in psychology. So ultimately that the client is at the center and we are thinking about them, what they are feeling, what they are experiencing. And that's where the core condition came from. So empathy in this context is thought of as unconditional positive regard, which is quite interesting, isn't it? When you think about that, unconditional, there's no conditions on it, there's no limits. Being in a true empathetic state means that you have an unconditional positive regard for the person who you're speaking to. That means ultimately there aren't any conditions on what I'm thinking or feeling or this space that I have with you. I am completely non-judgmental and in that unconditional positive space that is for you, for the person who is coming to me in this situation and speaking to me. So empathy is ultimately a two-way transaction. It's not enough for us to 100% be in the person who's come to us frame of reference, understanding their feelings. They must also perceive that we understand. And that's the key thing. So some sentences that I think quite simple sentences that are really helpful and powerful, actually empathetic sentences, someone sharing something with you, a really simple response is wow, I can really imagine how difficult that must be for you to be experiencing. What I'm doing in that is that I'm allowing them to see that I fully understand that actually what they're going through and what they're experiencing must be really tough. When they feel at some level that they've been understood by you, that's when they call the empathy circle has been completed, which is a whole other remit and a whole other point of view. But ultimately, we are striving. So I spoke earlier on about the analogy of kind of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. A phrase which I prefer is that you walk in that person's shoes, but keep your own socks on. So you've got your own, you are there, you are very much understanding, but we're taking a walk in their shoes. So, protecting yourself, it's really important that when we show up empathetically for others, we are providing them with a space where they feel non-judged, they don't feel judged. We have that unconditional space that we're offering them, but also we are protecting ourselves. All right. When having a great deal of empathy makes you concerned for the well-being and happiness of others, and it can feel quite overwhelming actually if you enter into that space fully. It also means that we can get overwhelmed, we can get burnt out, overstimulated by always putting ourselves in the space of thinking about other people's emotions. All right. And this is called empathy fatigue. It's similar it's kind of exhaustion from a physical and emotional response. So we can feel actually, interestingly, if we don't look after ourselves and protect ourselves while entering into an empathetic space with others, one of the symptoms that we can have is what's called emotional negativity, which actually means that instead of we're almost become too empathetic, we don't protect ourselves, we don't take time for ourselves, and actually we become quite negative to the person. Actually, it kind of fully goes the other way, where actually we can lead to kind of empathetic distress, which is that we can respond quite negatively in those situations, which is even more reason why we need to protect ourselves when we are holding that space for others. So you'll see on the screen right now, so setting your boundaries. So anybody, if you were able to join a webinar that I held recently on setting boundaries and upholding them, particularly within an online world. However, if you weren't able to join that, please head over to the This Can Happen Hub and you'll be able to find the recording in there. And then it's a much deeper conversation in and around boundaries. But set your boundaries. It's really important, particularly as champions, when it's a side desk role, that we really protect ourselves. We protect our time, we protect and make sure that we're not overwhelmingly taking it on into a bigger space than we have for it. Talk about personal safety measures. That's with any conversations. We make sure that when we're having those conversations, we are in a safe space. People know we're having those conversations. We don't have them at home, things like that. Talking about support systems, there's a few things on there about decompressing, which actually we're going to come on to on the next slide. So I'm not going to talk about those too much, but we talk about energy vampires. So essentially people who kind of pull from you an awful lot. It kind of that leans into my kind of Reiki side, but ultimately, and what we're going to move on to now is decompressing, but how you connect to your spirit and find joy and energy following those spaces, and that comes from any context, any space where you are providing support for others. It's really important that you find time afterwards. The bit in bold at the moment at the bottom, for anybody, I always talk about lunches and breaks. This is the other thing that I talk a lot about, which is that remembering emotions are energy in motion, and they need to flow. So ultimately, holding a space for someone empathetically is hugely powerful for that person, but you need to protect yourself, and also you will have an emotional response after it, and actually you can't hold that in. You need to let it flow. So quick ways to find calm afterwards. So when you have truly held that space for somebody empathetically, you've held that space, that person has been provided with that truest sense of really feeling listened to, really feeling like their feelings and thoughts and experiences are being understood. Ways that you are then able to check in with yourself. So some of these you might already do. Some of them are a little bit more so than others, but hopefully lots of them are easy. So a walk, go for a walk. I often say to people that it's one of the things that comes up in a moment is get outside. And we'll come on to that. But walking, also, if you don't have a huge volume of time, actually you can walk within your building. If where your place of work is quite large and you don't actually have time to leave the building and go for a walk, actually walk within the building, in a sense of just allowing your body to move. It's a really, really good way of decompressing. Talking about smell, actually I broaden it out to any senses. Some people find looking at things, so if you're a visual person in terms of your main dominant sense, but smelling something soothing, that's why essential oils are really hugely powerful. Reframing, so reframing what they've shared with you and your responses to holding that space for them. Again, another proprioceptic. So another proprioceptic thing you can do is chewing gum, actually. It pulls you into your physical self. And because it connects to your proprioceptic self, It's a really good, easy, quick way of decompressing, which is quite interesting. Writing it down, it can be about, obviously from a champion's perspective, everything has to be confidential, and we can't be sharing any of those things. But writing down how you feel actually can be really, really important. So how you're feeling following those conversations. Visualization, again, we are picturing how that might feel, letting go of it, all of those things. Breath work, anybody who does breath work, breathing really deeply, the power of three, very slow, in depth, really fully into your chest, really fully allowing that breath to come into your body and breathing out deeply. Very quick, very easy. You don't have to be in a space away from others. You can do it quietly at your desk, at home, lots of those things. Relaxing our muscles. Again, a really, really simple way if you're feeling quite overwhelmed. In this context is I actually talk about toes, but you can do it broader than that. I'll give you a toe example. So within your shoes, if you really, really tense your toes, so really, really tense your feet and then relax them. At the same time, if you can couple it with breathing, you'll be hugely impactful. But again, it's something that you're essentially tensing all your muscles up and then releasing them. And again, it's proprioceptive. It pulls it into a body physical context and actually allows a release. It's not going to fully release everything, but in those sense of overwhelming, it can really be quite a short term, short fix. Water, have a drink. Ideally, get in some water. Not always feasible when we're at work, but water is pretty amazing. And get outside. If you can walk outside, smelling something, deep, breathing deeply, you're going to be able to kind of decompress and pull yourself into the space much quicker. But ultimately, just getting outside of the building, out of air conditioning, out of your home environment, even if it is just quite literally standing outside, deep breaths outside, not in that space, um, it can have lots of powerful impact. So hopefully some of those you might just think I'm never going to do that, and that is absolutely fine. The idea of when I offer these quite quick ways to calm, the idea being is that you might connect to one of them quite easily. So kindness versus empathy. This is always pulling ourselves back into this situation before we move into how to use our body language and how we're talking empathetically. But before we do that, I think this is really important. Kindness versus empathy. So again, please comment in the chat box. It'd be great to kind of have a think about how you feel kindness and empathy are similar, or maybe how they're different. Um, Ultimately, they are different, but I would say kindness is something that's really important in life, um, but also is very, very different. So it's important that we take the time to think about the differences. So kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate of others. All right. So a kind person in a situation might give solutions as an example. So they might give a quick, simple solution because it's kind. I can offer something kindly to you. They care about other people. They value others, and they often do nice things for other people. When you're in trouble, kind people will be there for you, will talk to you, will offer you help. They often offer sympathy and recognize that you're finding things really, really tough. However, it is very different to empathy, where you connect with that person and what they're truly feeling in that emotional context. So empathy, different to kindness. So kindness is often seen as quite a relatively quick, simple solution, not a bad thing. If the whole world was a bit kinder, I think we'd all be in a very, very different world. But ultimately, being kind, please don't underestimate or devalue being kind, because being kind means that you ultimately care about others. But it means actually, from this context, being kind often means that you offer solutions and you quite often do something. Whereas an empathetic person really listens, connects, and wants to understand what the person is feeling and going through. And that's the difference. Hopefully that makes sense. So the golden rules of empathy. Um, First of all, I call it losing the I. There is more to that sentence, but hopefully you will have anybody who's come to webinars before. I quite often put images up because I find that images stick with us. But this is a sentence that I find sticks quite a lot, and that is that you lose the I. You ultimately are self-aware. When we are being empathetic with somebody else, we do, I had that happen to me. I did this. I did that. What we do is lose the I. That must be really difficult for you. I can really sense how it is all so much with everything else that you've got going on. I can feel how challenging this is for you. That is a nice sentence. But ultimately, we are being really self-aware that we're not pulling ourselves into the conversation. It's ultimately about the other person. Park our urge to rescue. We are all ultimately fixers. The reason why you do the role is because you like helping others, you care about other people, and you want to make a difference. That ultimately means that deep rooted, we are fixers and we want to rescue people. When we are empathetically showing up, different to kindness, we are showing up, we are offering that person that space to feel listened to and genuinely understood emotionally and everything that they're going through. We're not there to rescue them. We're not there to fix it all. That's not what we're here for. And lastly, be genuine. If you are, if listening to someone does emotionally affect you, it is absolutely fine to be natural. Okay, and be genuine. It's a really core skill of being empathetic. And you'll see there's another quote at the bottom there by Carl Rogers. But empathy is a special way of coming to know another person and ourselves. And whole other thing would be being empathetic to yourself, but it's kind of attuning and understanding other people. It's a really it comes back to that core skill. So here on the screen, last kind of one that we're gonna look at before we come into empathetic listening and the core skills of empathetic listening. There are lots of things on the screen there, which is how we can enter into a conversation with somebody. Some of them are quite easy in being able to look at them and think, well, that is definitely not empathy. Others sometimes a little bit more tricky. And very much it's good to, while we're looking at these things, to think, well, what on there is not empathy. So as an example, interrogating would be quite simple to know that that is not empathetic. It's not an empathetic space. Neither is one-upping, which is the person sharing something with you and you being like, oh yeah, I know that, but this happened to me, and it's almost my experience is more and more severe and more of the things that's called one-upping. Advising, interestingly, is empathy. Because ultimately, when we are offering advice to someone, we are truly listening. So actually, I think advice and signposting are very, very closely connected. Advising or signposting someone is truly empathetic, because if we have listened to them enough and listened to them in the truest context of truly offering them that space, that non-judgmental, unconditional space, we have listened enough to be able to say, my advice after what you've shared is that actually I think this resource would be really, really helpful. What that means is I've completely allowed myself to listen to what they're sharing in order to be able to advise and signpost onwards. Consoling is another one that's quite interesting. Consoling, I would say, is a 50-50, just to put it in there to kind of mix it up a little bit. It's not quite fully empathy, but it's not quite fully not empathy. Consoling is showing up empathetically. So we're kind of showing up for somebody, but it's also about support and reassurance when we're consoling someone. So consoling sits in the middle somewhere. Sympathy is not empathy. So sympathizing or sympathy, as I said at the beginning, although they share a lot of the spelling of how they're spelt, they're not. Sympathy is not empathy. Sympathy is almost feeling sorry or pity for someone without sharing their emotional experience. So I can have sympathy for someone. I can think, wow, I feel really sorry for what that person's going through, but I'm not connecting to what they're going through emotionally and truly embodying what it's like to show up empathetically. So, our practical skills that we take from now, learning what empathy is, how it shows up, why it's important, protecting ourselves while showing up empathetically, into hopefully some really helpful and practical ways that we can do this. So, empathetic listening in its core is about acceptance. Okay, it's about respecting what that person is going through, even though it might be different from yourself. Key thing. So when I spoke about that unconditional regard, another way of thinking about that is true acceptance. We are not judging them. We are genuinely showing up and saying, your feelings, experience, and values, are they really different from my own? I can truly accept that that is really difficult for you. That's acceptance. That's the core, one of the core skills. The next thing is genuineness. So showing the person you accept them by what you say and you do. We don't make any moral judgment about them, about their situation, no matter what our thoughts and feelings are. If, however, always like to put a caveat in, if when somebody is sharing something with you, it is very different from your own belief system, very different from your way of life, and actually you feel that you cannot be the person that that person needs you to be, because actually what they're bringing to you is causing conflict for you, it is absolutely fine to say to that person, I really want you to have someone who is able to hold this space for you, give you advice, and genuinely be able to empathetically listen to everything you've got going on. But I feel like I'm not quite the right person for you due to just my thoughts and feelings. And so I actually, if you know, there are some other mental health first aiders, would you be happy for me to suggest someone else that you might be able to speak to? It is absolutely fine to say that. And that's the caveat that I always put in. Empathy, all of what we're talking about, but ultimately feel what they are feeling. Simplest way to do it is that we are understanding what they're saying and coming back to that. So, day-to-day skills. So there's an active listening skills from Samaritans. So these cross over into lots of training. Some of them, not all of them, but this particular active listening kind of acronym is from Samaritans. It's really, really helpful. The acronym is SHUSH. So we're going to go through it letter by letter. So the S is that we show we care. Ultimately, when we are really showing up actively into that empathetic listening space, we need to give our full attention. We need to be engaged. Okay. Key thing for that is that when we are online, it's easy to maybe not fully engage. Some people find that trickier online, but equally, as much as you can see everything that that person's doing, you have to remember that they can do the same back. It's really important that when we are really entering into that space, we are able to give them our full attention, really park it. And if we're not able to, it's also absolutely fine to say, I'm so glad that you've reached out to me. Am I, if it isn't something you can park, to kind of arrange a time where you can check back in with them. But hopefully you would be able to park what it is to really show up with full attention. The H is about patience. All right, so having patience. It's effective listening is about creating trust with the other person. They shouldn't feel rushed. If they've paused, we wait. We don't interrupt. I talk about counting to 10 in your head before you respond. Ultimately, if someone's coming to you to ask some advice, sometimes it can be really difficult to verbalize it. And actually, if we only wait a couple seconds before we kind of interrupt in, they may never kind of get out what they've come to ask advice for or offload. Use those open questions. I joke about this because I talk about this an awful lot, but the moment anybody asks me to think of an open question, my mind goes blank and I can never think of one. But ultimately, open-ended questions encourage them to talk. How are you feeling today? How is this affecting you? How are you thinking about that? However, if you ask a closed question, which is a question that ultimately the answer is yes or no, sometimes a little bit, maybe, or I don't know, kind of a very short response. A really easy way to add to that, a really core skill of that therapists use a lot is, can you tell me a little bit more about that? It's fine. The answer is no. Thank you for being really open and honest. Could you tell me a little bit more about why it is that you feel like that. All right. So it allows you to kind of enter into that space. We talk about S, so say it back. I'm going to come on to it in a moment, but ultimately, um, one of the core skills that we spoke about earlier on was that the person to really feel empathy is that the person who's sharing with you really feels like you understand what they're going through. So when we say it back, it's about repeating back to somebody what they've shared with you. All right. Not only are you checking that you've heard what they're saying, but it also means that you're not putting your own interpretation into the conversation. Ultimately, I'm just going to say back what you've told me. And H, have courage. We know that often, people, quite often in Champions World, people will seek you out rather than the other way around. But sometimes when we are seeking the conversation and checking in with somebody else, if we've spotted those signs, that ultimately we have to have a little bit of courage in the fact that although we might make us feel uncomfortable, ultimately we are providing that space for somebody else. So body language, which often comes in, body language is a deep subject, but I picked one that hopefully it's called the Solar Technique by Egan in 1975, but is a key skill that you will recognize lots of these things that are on the screen. Lots of ways that you can use listening without judgment. This particularly focuses on our body language, ultimately. The acronym is SOLAR, so SOLER. So the S is that we sit squarely onto the subject. There's always caveats, ideally slightly off center. If we are facing somebody direct, we pull in our kind of knowledge of neurodiversity and things like that into the conversation. Some people really struggle with that kind of front on space. It also can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes. So I think if you are, even if you're online, you can slightly offset yourself and in face to face as well. Interestingly, males tend to open up 87% more likely to open up if they're side by side. So going for a walk, in a car, things like that. Sat at an office side by side. Females actually are much more likely to open up when they are face to face. We tend to like and seek out that the emotional connection that comes from eye contact and facial expressions, which is interesting. Open posture. If you are an arm crosser and I told you not to cross your arms, you're going to feel really uncomfortable. And ultimately, you're not really going to be able to be in that space for somebody else if you feel uncomfortable. If you cross arms, absolutely fine. Maybe try crossing your hands in your lap. But ultimately, all of these things that I share with you, it's about picking maybe one or two across the board and creating your own style. It's important that this is natural for you. These theories and techniques are beautiful and wonderful, lots of things that you pull out of them, but nobody does all of them at all. Lean slightly in. Again, it can happen face to face or online. Ultimately, we know that if somebody slightly leans in when they're talking to us, what it shows us subconsciously and from a body language perspective is I'm here, I'm present, I'm listening. I'm in the space with you. In contrast to leaning back shows that I'm quite disengaged. And actually there's a lot of research actually is one of the key things you can do is kind of slightly leaning in. Not too much because obviously then that takes away the person's individual space, but is a good thing to be mindful of. Maintaining eye contact can be difficult for people. So eye contact, again, as I said, something to be aware of, not something we hugely, really, really focus on as being our dominant one, but it's something to be aware of. Even if it's, I call it kind of eye catching. So even if you catch the person's eye, you don't have to maintain eye contact all the time. Another really good hint, if you find eye contact sometimes challenging, is to look at a person's eyebrows. You're not actually looking at their eyes. And relax while you're doing all of that, while you're remembering all those other things. But ultimately, as I said, it's about pulling from all of these and finding your own style. So mirroring is another technique that you can use. So this is repeating back, similar to the shush. So it's about saying back to them what they've shared with you. Okay, we don't change it. Ultimately, you are just reflecting back to them. It can be called reflecting or mirroring. And ultimately, if someone says to you, I'm really struggling to get on in a relationship or having a really, really difficult time, your mirror back would be, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I can hear that you're having a really difficult time in your relationship at the moment, and you're finding that you're not able to connect with that person. Now, what happens when we use mirroring, or another deeper part is paraphrasing, is the technical term of it, is that what will happen is that the person will either correct you or will add to the story or will add to what they're sharing. So if I repeat back, so someone has come to you and said they're having a really difficult time in their relationship, finding it really, really tricky, work-life balance. So you're repeating that back to them. So thank you so much for sharing it with me. I can hear you having lots of problems, you're having a challenging time in your relationship, and your work-life balance is proving to be the biggest part of that. What the person will then do is say, no, 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 that's not what I meant. What I meant was this. Or they will say, yeah, that's exactly. And the reason why it's the work-life balance is, and they will add to it. So it's a really, really good skill. The mirroring I find is a paraphrasing is the technical word. So paraphrasing is deeper than mirroring. It's ultimately repeating back using your own words, but in a shorter sentence. So we kind of so mirroring is direct reflection back, almost directly reflecting. Paraphrasing is a different technique, which is where we listen to what they're saying and we repeat it back in a shorter way. So in that example, someone said, I'm having some challenging times in my relationship, really struggling to connect, and work-life balance is just astronomical. I can't get on top of it. What your paraphrase back would be is that, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm really glad you sought me out to have this conversation. So what I can understand is that work-life balance at the moment is really tricky for you and your relationship as part of that. So what I've done is kind of what they've shared with me might be really, really long and powerful, hugely impactful to offload it, but I've kind of condensed it down into into a smaller sentence. And what you do is actually reflects back the essence of what that person has said, and quite often is really, really helpful when you're part of a conversation. And then coming to the end of a conversation when someone's talking to you enables you to then really say, I'm just going to kind of summarize what you've shared with me, and if I'm right in understanding, this is what I think it is. Obviously paraphrase, repeat it back to them in that kind of the essence of what they've said. And then what that enables you to do by truly listening, truly being able to understand what they're saying, breaking it down into the core of what they're saying, it then will enable you to say, based on that, actually, this is the signposting that I think would be really, really helpful. This is where I think you would be able to go. So our skills tick list. So first of all, and this is our last bit that we're talking to before we open up into our Q&A. So curiosity. So a skill tick list for a truly empathetic conversation is being curious. So curious about what the other people think and trying to understand it from their perspective. We've spoken a lot about that authentic listening. Genuinely we all do it, but stop planning what you're going to say. Really focus on what they're saying. And it's really not a bad thing to say, thank you so much for sharing. I'm just going to gather my thoughts before I respond. Absolutely fine. No one's expecting a response straight away, because actually, if you respond straight away, it actually means that you're not truly listening. We spoke about repeating, rewording, mirroring, or paraphrasing as those key skills. Imagination, or that true unconditional regard. So it's really thinking about what it's like to be in their situation. Open-mindedness, really allow yourself to really be open-minded about what that person is thinking and feeling. Vulnerability, showing up vulnerably in an empathetic conversation comes with lots of dangers. There's lots of deeper work about vulnerability, but actually respectfully sharing your reactions and feelings actually confirms that you're really fully understanding what they're going through. We've spoken about self-awareness, so taking that time to understand how your thoughts and feelings are afterwards, taking time to decompress and look after yourself. And lastly, being sensitive to others' emotions. So developing your emotional radar to pick up on what other people are feeling through body language, through facial experiences, listening. We call it between the lines, but ultimately really, truly entering into that space. And lastly, just before we enter into our Q&A, It's really important. And I know I covered protecting yourself, setting your boundaries when you show up empathetically. But I just want to end before we open up the Q&A about how it's really, really important that the quote says you can't pour from an empty cup. Okay. So it's really, really important that you take care of yourself. You really are in this space because you care about others, which says a lot about you as an individual. And the fact that you're doing this side desk in addition to everything else you do says a lot about you. But please make sure that while you're showing up, you also take that time to decompress and take that time for yourself so that you are able to be in that space for others and to look after yourself as much as you are for others. So, thank you so much for listening. There is a lot in there, I'm fully aware. But yeah, so that's the end of my part, and I'm going to hand over to Jamie, so that we can have any questions that you might have, and I might be able to answer any of those in the space that we have now.
Brilliant, Heidi. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and so useful as well. So thank you very, very much for that. And we've had several questions come through. So I'm just going to start with some of these, Heidi, in these final 10 minutes that we have of this session. So the first of these is, where is the line between empathetic listening and becoming someone's ongoing emotional support?
It's tricky, isn't it? It's very, very tricky. I would say empathy, as I've said, is a way of being. So I think um, it's very mindful. It comes back to those boundaries. It's very important that although you are showing up empathetically in that space for somebody when they seek you out, it's really important that genuinely with that person you can be really open and honest in that context and say, I'm so glad you come to speak to me, and I really will be here to listen to you empathetically. But ultimately, I'm not a therapist. This isn't my role. I'm really happy to listen and check in with you regularly. But actually, there's lots of places that we have that we can signpost you to that will be able to do the deeper work with you. But I'm really happy to check in and listen to what's going on so that I can provide you with the best signposting to be able to help with what you're going through. And I think that's the key thing to remember.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heidi. Next question is, what should we do if we feel triggered or emotionally affected during a conversation?
Yes, and you can be, and particularly when you are really showing up in that kind of unconditional regard in that space, people will share and will share deeper sometimes. So protecting yourself, if you are emotionally triggered, can happen, and I won't say will happen, can happen. For some people, it can happen during. For some people, it can happen afterwards. Um, I always say that showing up empathetically is showing up genuinely. And that was one of the core skills that I mentioned. So genuinely say it as it is. If you feel comfortable, if you are genuinely emotionally affected by what they're saying, I think you can say that. You can say, I'm actually being really affected by what you shared with me. Um, I'm so glad that you're sharing it with me and you can feel that you can be that open and honest. I'm just finding it quite a lot. Could we take a little break? Could we go for a walk and then come back in and talk about it in a moment? But I think actually in the truest sense of empathy, saying that you've emotionally had that response, actually I think is another is a whole nother level of empathy. But I think don't shy away from saying to somebody, actually what you're sharing, I'm so glad and so thankful that you're able to feel like you can trust me, but it's actually affecting me. And so would we be okay if we just went and grabbed a drink, or we kind of we keep going, but could we have a little pause right now, or could we kind of actually it might be better if we signpost this on or otherwise. And I think that's absolutely fine to say that as long as you're happy doing that.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. Next question is, how can we speak to non-empathetic bosses when handling mental well-being struggles?
Good question. I like this question. So, it's tricky, isn't it? When somebody, I had a really interesting question on this topic earlier on this week about is empathy something that can be taught or learned or developed? And the honest answer is there are people in the world who are naturally more empathetic than others, and that is, I would argue that most of you who are champions are probably naturally empathetic because you have put yourself forward into this role. Others sometimes either don't open themselves up to it or find it tricky. They just really, really find it tricky, and that is absolutely fine in that context. So when you are, if you have a line manager or a manager who is quite non-empathetic to mental health and mental well-being, um, I think it's really, really tricky, and I think it's about being genuine with that person and empathetically connecting with them is about saying to them, as simple as I know that we have such a heavy workload, and I know that talking about mental health or being aware of everything that's going on in the team is an added stress on top of that. I know that, and I know that that can make what we already have even more complicated and difficult to deal with. So, what you're doing is almost demonstrating a mirroring exercise of kind of giving them empathy through them not showing it almost, and actually right at the beginning on feels slide deck back along. I was saying that actually research has shown that by being empathetic to somebody else encourages them to be empathetic back as well. So actually I think sometimes, as I just said, I know having to manage mental health on top of everything else that we've got going on, and me coming to talk to you or me telling you about what's going on in the team, and the fact that we're all finding this really difficult from a well-being and a mental health perspective is really tricky, on top of everything else that we've got going on. And I really do understand that. What you're doing is showing up empathetically to them, and it's kind of mirroring back. And I would say that um, might not necessarily get you the support you need, but I think it's a good practice, because I think the more you do that, the more that actually encourages others to say, "Oh, hang on, actually that felt like she really understood me," and it does encourage a growth of that feeling the other way as well.
Brilliant, Heidi. Thank you. And probably the last question that we have time for is, do you have any advice on how we can demonstrate empathy in time-pressured or high-intensity environments?
Another good question. So, empathy can be through quite so time pressured environments, time pressured conversations. It's wonderful to have a truly empathetic conversation that can be really long and kind of ultimately open ended. You can check in multiple times, but when you are time restricted or have lots of other factors, empathy can be quite tricky to pull into that sentence, and that's where I say about if you can develop and really think about phrases, so empathetic phrases. I think if you're short on time and kind of you want to pull empathy into the space that you're in, but you haven't got all the time to have a really deep empathetic conversation, sometimes those phrases, so things like I can really understand how that's really difficult for you. Um, it's the wording of things that I think you can really, they can be really, really powerful in that authentic listening space. So I think genuinely listening to that person, and essentially building up that emotional radar. But I think when you're caught in time restraints, and you don't have all the luxury of lots of time, I think if you can use phrases such as that, where I can really understand how that must be really difficult for you. It says a lot in quite a short, powerful word, and tone of your voice as well can be really impactful.
Brilliant. Heidi, thank you so much. And that is pretty much all we have time for today. So thank you very much to everyone watching. We hope you've enjoyed this session. And thank you, Heidi, as always, for your advice and guidance. Always so useful. So thank you very much for that. The session has been recorded and will be uploaded into the Champions Hub. I've popped the link in the chat box for this. So please do log on and access and watch the recording for this and past webinars and anonymized surgery notes and all of the resources that the Champions Hub has to offer. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And when you jump off this link, a short survey will pop up. If you could just take 2 minutes to please complete the survey, let us know what you think. That would be incredibly helpful. But yeah, thank you once again, everyone. Thank you, Heidi, and see you all very soon.
Take care.